The wind sliced through the South Dakota peaks, a mournful howl that tangled in the jagged cliffs and spilled into the shadowed valleys below. Eli Rogers pressed upward, his boots grinding gravel into the frozen earth, each step a steady thud against the silence. The cold gnawed at his knuckles, rough and cracked from nights spent twisting wires and shaping steel. But he barely noticed. Above him, the sky roiled, a bruised sprawl of purple and gray streaked with an unnatural shimmer that set his teeth on edge. It wasn't a storm rolling in, it was their storm. 3 years ago, he'd have been rattling through these mountains in his old Ford, Lena's laughter spilling from the cracked cab, Emma's soft humming weaving through the hum of the engine. The cornfields had glowed golden then, rippling under a sun that didn't yet carry death in its light. Pristine Skies Corp stole that. Their drought relief arrived in silver trails cutting the clouds, in rain that tasted like rust and sank into the soil like a plague. First, the crops failed, stalks turning gray overnight, roots dissolving into dust. Then the coughing started. Lena's small body trembled with it, a rasp that scraped Eli's heart raw until it faded into a silence too heavy to bear. Emma held on longer, her skin paling as strange lesions crept across her arms, her breath thinning until it slipped away in his calloused hands. The doctors muttered about pneumonia, bad luck. Eli knew better. He'd watched those planes, listened to the radio's promises. That rain didn't bring life. It brought death. Now he was a shell, hollowed by loss and forged by rage. The wind carried that metallic hum he'd first caught when Lena pointed upward, her voice bright despite the strain. "Look, Daddy, shimmer clouds." He chuckled then, ruffling her hair. He didn't chuckle anymore. That hum was the pulse of Pristine Skies' machines, and tonight he'd silence it. Ahead, the mobile seeding station crouched on a rocky outcrop, its steel bulk swallowing the last streaks of a blood-red sunset. Rockets hid inside, coiled in silos like snakes waiting to strike. At dawn, they'd launch, spewing their poison over another valley, another family too trusting to see the shimmer for what it was. Eli's lips twisted into a snarl. Not tonight. He sank to a crouch, his pack settling against his back with a soft thud. Inside, charges clinked, crude, homemade, but deadly. For 18 months he'd turned his farmer's hands into weapons, perfecting explosives that left scars on Pristine Skies' empire. Utah's loading dock had burned first, a fireball lighting the desert. Colorado's shed followed, then a tower in Idaho. Each a black pin on the map stashed in his truck, each a wound he'd carved. This station gleamed newer, its metal walls taunting him with their shine. He'd answer that taunt with fire. A thorn caught his palm as he braced against a rock, the sting sharp and sudden. Blood welled, dark against his weathered skin, then vanished. Flesh knitted shut in a heartbeat, smooth as if the cut had never been. Eli stared at his hand, flexing it slowly. He didn't know why it happened, this healing that refused to let him break. It started after that first rain, after he'd knelt in the mud by Emma's grave, fists pounding until they bled. A shovel's edge had sliced him that night, and the wound sealed before the dirt dried. A quirk, a curse, it didn't matter. It kept him standing, kept him fighting. "Nothing stops me now," he muttered, his voice a low growl swallowed by the wind. The station loomed closer, maybe 40 yards off. Eli eased the pack from his shoulder, unzipping it with care. The charges glinted faintly. Wires coiled tight, timers blinking red in the dusk. Security was light. Pristine Skies relied on the mountain's solitude over guards. Their mistake. He'd hit enough of their sights to know where they bled. Joints where steel met steel, power lines feeding the silos. His hands moved steady, planting the first charge beneath a strut braced against the launch bay. It clicked into place, a crisp sound against the wind's wail. The second nestled under a fuel line, the third at the base of a silo door. He'd run this in his head 100 times, each move a vow to the dead. The clouds thickened overhead, their green tinge deepening, a sickly glow he'd never shake. It mirrored that day when rain fell heavy and wrong, pooling in iridescent streaks across his fields. He'd stood in it, tasting metal on his tongue, not knowing it was the last time Lena's laugh would ring out. His fist clenched, nails digging in. Pain sparked, then faded, his skin healing clean. He shook it off, setting the last charge beneath the silo bay's hinge. One spark, and this thing would be dust. The hum grew louder, a vibration sinking into his bones. Those clouds weren't just gathering. They were moving, coiling like something alive. His pulse quickened. This wasn't about drought. It was control, poison masked as mercy. He'd stop it here, before another kid's lungs gave out, before another field turned to ash. A shrill alarm shattered the quiet red lights flaring along the station's walls. Machinery groaned inside, gears grinding, engines spooling up with a deep rumble. A cold, synthetic voice crackled through the air. Security breach detected. Rocket systems engaging. Damn it, Eli hissed, his breath fogging in the chill. A motion sensor. He'd missed it, tripped it like some fool. His plan, quick, clean, gone before they noticed, was shot. The rockets were priming now, not at dawn. He ducked behind the strut, heart slamming against his ribs. The air thickened, that metallic taste sharp on his tongue again. Above, the green clouds churned faster, ready to unleash their venom. He pulled the detonator from his jacket, its weight grounding him. His thumb hovered over the switch, trembling slightly. This wasn't how he'd seen it, slipping out under cover of night, leaving them scrambling. But when the stakes were this high, plans didn't matter. Those rockets weren't flying. Not tonight, not ever. He'd tear this place down, let the mountains claim the wreckage, for Lena's small hand in his, for Emma's voice fading into the dark, for every home pristine skies had emptied. Thunder rumbled, close and sharp, a growl from a sky about to break. Eli's lips curled, baring teeth in a fierce grin. "You don't get to fly," he growled, the words lost in the storm's rising roar. The detonator rested heavy in his palm, a promise forged in steel and fire. One push, and it had all come crashing down. He held his breath, the world narrowing to that single, burning moment. The first charge erupted with a roar that split the South Dakota night, a guttural bellow of flame clawing up the seeding station's steel hide. Eli Rogers hunched behind the strut, the heat slamming into his chest like a fist, scorching the edges of his jacket. The blast's echo ricocheted off the peaks, a war cry that drowned the wind's mournful howl for a fleeting moment. That wind fought back, fierce and cold, raking his face with icy talons, tugging at his hair, but he didn't flinch. Above, the green-tinged clouds churned, their metallic shimmer pulsing as if they breathed, alive, angry, unnatural. The station's alarm shrieked on, a shrill, incessant wail slicing through the deep growl of rocket engines spooling inside, too fast, too damn soon. Pristine skies had snatched his timeline, ripped it from his hands like they'd ripped everything else. Eli's answer was simple. Ruin. His chest tightened. A knot of fury 3 years in the forging. Lena's cough echoed in his skull, small and ragged, a sound that carved him open every night until it stopped, leaving a silence heavier than the earth over her grave. Emma's hand lingered in his memory, frail and cold, slipping away as her breath faded to nothing. That poison rain had taken them, stolen his golden fields, his family, his life, and left him a hollowed-out shell. But hollow didn't mean empty. Rage filled the void, a fire that burned hotter with every site he'd torched, every pin he'd turned black on his map. Utah's loading dock went up in flames, Idaho's tower crumpled, Colorado's shed melted to slag. Now, this station was next, and he'd bury it deep. The detonator quivered in his grip, slick with sweat despite the biting chill. One charge down, 4 left to light. The first had torn a fuel line, sending sparks skittering across the station's edge like fireflies gone mad. But the silos stood unbroken, their steel doors trembling as rockets primed within. He needed to get inside, plant the rest where they'd rip the heart out of this beast. His thumb brushed the switch, hovering, too soon, and he'd trap himself in the inferno. Too late, and those rockets would climb, spewing their venom over another valley, another home too trusting to taste the lie in the rain. He'd seen that lie firsthand, felt it coat his tongue, watched it kill. Not again. A sharp hum sliced through the chaos, mechanical, predatory, distinct from the cloud's eerie shimmer. Eli's head snapped up, eyes narrowing against the wind. Drones. 3 of them, sleek and black as oil, peeled from the station's roof, their blades whining like a swarm of hornets stirred from sleep. Red lights blinked along their hulls, scanners cutting through the dusk, sweeping the ground in crimson arcs. They'd locked onto him, zeroed in on the heat of his breath, the thud of his pulse. "Come on, then," he growled, voice rough as gravel, shoving the detonator into his jacket pocket. He bolted for the side door, boots pounding gravel, the wind shoving him sideways like it wanted him down. He wouldn't give it the satisfaction. The door loomed ahead, a slab of steel half ajar from neglect, pristine sky's arrogance showing in every rusted bolt. Eli didn't slow, didn't hesitate. His boot slammed into the lock, metal screeching as it buckled inward, the frame groaning under the force. He stumbled through, the station's interior swallowing him whole, a cavern of noise and shadow. Gears ground in the walls, a relentless clatter that shook the floor. Pipes hissed overhead, steam curling in the air like ghosts. Screens lined the control room, flickering red with warnings. System breach. Launch initiated. But no techs manned them. No guards stood watch. Just machines, cold and obedient, doing their dirty work. Eli didn't give a damn about shutting them down. He wasn't here to negotiate with circuits or coax them into sleep. He was here to break them, to shatter their steel bones and burn their poison where it stood. His pack thudded against his spine as he moved, the charges inside rattling like loose teeth in a jar. The silos waited ahead, a row of steel giants 30 feet down a narrow hall, their doors glowing faintly with the heat of priming rockets. The air thickened with that metallic tang he'd tasted since Lena's last day, a bitter edge that clung to his throat. He ripped the pack open, fingers steady despite the tremor in his chest, and yanked out a charge. It was an ugly thing, wires twisted into knots, casing scratched and dented from nights of restless tinkering, but it was lethal. He'd made sure of that. Kneeling, he wedged it beneath the first silo's hinge, pressing it firm against the steel until the timer blinked to life. 30 seconds. Enough time to set the rest, if he didn't falter. A pipe overhead burst as he straightened, spraying scalding steam across his arm. Pain flared, sharp and white-hot, skin blistering in angry red welts, then gone. flesh smoothed out in a heartbeat, pink and whole, the burn fading like a bad dream. Eli shook it off, flexing his hand with a grunt. That healing had kept him alive through worse. Shrapnel slicing his gut in Utah, a beam crushing his ribs in Idaho. It started with the rain, same as the dying, a quirk he couldn't explain. Where Lena and Emma broke under its weight, he rebuilt, over and over. "Try harder," he snarled, voice low, turning to the second charge. He slammed it against a power conduit snaking along the wall, the timer ticking awake. 25 seconds. The drones found him then. Their whine pierced the hall, a high-pitched scream as they swarmed through the busted door, blades slicing the air into ribbons. Eli ducked as the first opened fire. A staccato burst that chewed into the wall above his head, spitting plaster and sparks. Bullets ricocheted, one grazing his chest, tearing through his shirt and carving a hot line across his skin. He staggered, blood soaking the fabric, then stopping, the wound sealing shut, the slug clattering to the floor like a spent shell. His lungs heaved, but he was whole. "That all you got?" he roared, the words tearing from his throat over the alarm's wail. He lunged forward, snatching the third charge from the pack. The drones adjusted, their gunfire tracking him, a relentless chatter that echoed in the tight space. He planted the charge at the base of the second silo, fingers slipping on sweat-slick steel as the timer blinked. 15 seconds. A round slammed into his shoulder, spinning him hard against the wall. Pain seared, bone splintering with a crack he felt more than heard, then snapping back, knitting together as he pushed off. The drones hovered closer, their red eyes glowing through the steam, cutting through the haze like bloodied stars. He didn't stop, couldn't stop. Every rasp of Lena's cough, every shadow of Emma's lesions burned in his skull, driving him on. The fourth charge came next, his hands scrambling to pull it free. He dove for the final silo, rolling under a burst of gunfire that pocked the floor where he'd stood. The drones were relentless, blades glinting as they closed the gap. 10 seconds on the timer. The rocket's hum climbed to a scream, a piercing wail that rattled his teeth. Green light pulsed through the silo doors, a sickly glare he'd seen in the rain that drowned his fields, his life. He jammed the charge beneath the last hinge, slamming it home with a grunt. 5 seconds. "For Lena," he whispered, voice cracking under the weight. "For Emma." Gunfire raked his chest. 3 hits in quick succession, punching through ribs like a hammer. He doubled over, blood pooling at his feet, dark and thick. Then gone. Bones reformed, flesh closed, his breath steadying as he straightened. The AI's voice cut through, cold and final. "Launch sequence in progress." Too late for them. He'd bury their poison here. The storm outside roared louder, rain hissing as it struck the ground, metallic, sharp, alive. Thunder cracked, shaking the walls, feeding the chaos he'd unleashed. Eli's grin was feral, teeth bared through pain that wouldn't linger. The drones circled, their blades a blur, but he stood, unkillable, defiant. 3 seconds. He pressed the detonator, the timers syncing with a chorus of sharp beeps. "Burn!" he snarled, diving back down the hall as the first silo erupted. Fire bloomed, a wall of heat that swallowed the drone's whine in an instant. Steel buckled, the floor lurching beneath him like a wounded beast. Eli rolled, shielding his face as shrapnel flew, jagged edges slicing his arms, his back. Each cut flared bright and faded fast, his body rebuilding quicker than the station could collapse. The second charge blew, a concussive wave that tore through the hall, followed by the third, silos splitting open, their guts spilling in bursts of green and gold. Rockets ignited mid-launch, their toxic payloads igniting in fiery clots, painting the air with sickly light. He scrambled to his feet, the hall caving in around him, walls groaning, ceiling sagging. The last charge ticked down 1 second. He lunged for the exit, boots slipping on debris as it detonated. The shockwave hit like a tidal wave, slamming him into the outer wall. Ribs snapped, his skull rang. Then silence, healing rushing in like a tide. He lay there, chest heaving, the station a blazing ruin at his back. The drones sparked and died in the wreckage, their red eyes winking out one by one, swallowed by the flames. Green rain sizzled on twisted metal, the storm's fury peaking outside. Eli pushed up onto his knees, blood-streaked but whole, his jacket smoking and torn. The silos were gone. Rockets, tanks, all reduced to ash and slag. He'd done it. One sight down, one wound carved deep into pristine sky's hide. His breath rasped, smoke stinging his lungs, but a grim satisfaction settled in his gut. They'd hunt him now, fiercer than ever. Let them try. He'd hit back harder. He staggered toward the tree line, the wind tearing at his hair, the metallic hum drowning in the storm's roar. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But tonight, he'd burned their poison where it stood. And that was a start. For Lena, for Emma, for the man he'd been before the rain.